There are many controversies and debates surrounding the issue of slavery in ancient Egypt. This is largely due to the terminology the ancient Egyptians used to refer to their workforce and how they defined slavery at the time. The way we think about slavery in the context of ancient Greece and Rome, or in the United States, was different from the practice of forced labor in ancient Egypt. Under slavery in these places, slaves were considered the full property of their masters and had little to no rights or protection. Slaves had been brought to Egypt from Asia since the Middle Kingdom, which lasted from 2040 to 1782 BC. Slaves were brought in mainly as prisoners of war or to be traded by slave traders. Once a person entered slavery in Egypt, his punishment was not eternal. Their duration as slaves was often limited, and they were promised freedom after a set period of time. The life of a slave in Egypt was probably different from that in other parts of the ancient and modern world. And in today's video, we are going to tell you about the life of a slave in ancient Egypt. But before we get into the video, make sure you subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon to never miss an update. Let's get started. What was it like to be a slave in ancient Egypt? This is a question historians have been asking for many years, but we may never honestly know the answer. However, we know what life was like for slaves thanks to what we can learn from ancient texts and archaeological evidence. Life as a slave in Egypt was not as hard as you think. Research supports the idea that life for slaves in ancient Egypt was not as bad as previously thought. An excellent example of this is the construction of the pyramids. Science has long believed that oppressed slaves built these pyramids and were subjected to horrific working conditions. However, a recent study found that most of the workers who built the pyramids were paid laborers and not slaves. According to Dr. Andrzej Ćwik, an Egyptologist at the Archaeological Museum in Poznan, the pyramids and other monumental royal structures were built by skilled and highly skilled workers. These workers would have dedicated their entire lives to the cause. While this does not mean that forced labor did not exist in society, it does mean that there is no archaeological evidence to support the idea that slaves were subjected to constant backbreaking labor. It seems that the slave population was made up of prisoners of war, usually foreigners. The population of slave laborers increased during the imperial period, 1550 to 1069 BC, thanks to several successful campaigns. These individuals would be of Asian, Nubian, and Syro-Palestinian origin. Despite these conquests, the Egyptian economy was never based on slavery as in other ancient civilizations, such as Rome. Instead, records indicate that the slave class was not necessarily separate from the free class, and that if a slave could purchase his freedom, he would be assimilated into society. In other words, Egyptian life did not depend on their contributions and would continue without them if the foundations of society required it. Dr. Ćwik also mentions that the life of a slave was not to be more difficult than that of any other Egyptian who performed necessary work in the community. In ancient Egyptian society, slaves were often treated like other workers. Although these workers lacked the freedoms enjoyed by the upper class, they were often highly skilled workers with skills that were in high demand. The fascinating thing about ancient Egyptian society was that slaves could assimilate into society quite easily. Their social status was not stigmatized as in other cultures and civilizations. Slaves in ancient Egypt were used for various tasks, including construction, agriculture, and household chores. A great example of their privilege is the idea that they were not considered a distinct social group despite the distinction. Often, slaves voluntarily gave up their freedoms due to debt, criminal records, or were prisoners of war. Although their legal status was unclear, they were still treated as ordinary citizens and even had access to private property. Dr. Ćwik also says that there were even cases of slaves marrying Egyptian women, who would have the same rights as men in ancient Egyptian society. Archaeological evidence supports the idea that slaves were treated like average workers. For example, the craftsmen who built the pyramids often had to obtain stone blocks as building materials. Slaves were sent to these stone masonry teams to help in the process. but it does not appear that they were mistreated or forced to live in inhumane conditions. They also worked closely with the craftsmen as private servants in their homes in Deir el-Medina, a laborer's town that built the tombs in the Valley of the Kings near Luxor. It makes sense that artisans and working-class slaves would be treated equally, since neither could move freely around the country. Typically, both individuals had strict social roles and were expected to perform their tasks. Rather, they understood the social structure of ancient Egyptian civilization. Although there was no clear social division between Egyptian slaves and citizens, it is important to note that the Egyptians looked down on other cultures and societies. Asians and Nubians were said to have a bad reputation in ancient Egypt. Researchers could speculate on the reasoning behind this, but once these individuals were enslaved into Egyptian culture, they were treated exceptionally well. Compared to other cultures, the Egyptians did not treat slaves as prisoners. These individuals adapted very well to Egyptian society, learned the language, and often married Egyptian women. Their ability to become model Egyptian citizens often opened fantastic opportunities for slaves. While slaves enjoyed jobs and responsibilities like all other members of the working class, there were unique instances where they achieved something more extraordinary. For example, May-per-Hari lived in the 15th century BC and was of Nubian descent. Despite his heritage, he was buried in the Valley of the Kings. His name, Lion on the battlefield, suggests that he may have had a great career in the Egyptian army or saved the life of a pharaoh. As in other cultures, slaves in ancient Egyptian society could earn their freedom. Emancipation could occur in different ways depending on the situation. For example, slaves could gain their freedom through adoption, where owners adopted the children of their adult slaves. Another method was the idea that the king could cleanse the slaves and purify them. Ultimately, this path would allow slaves to earn wages, have rights, marry, start a family, and even keep their original names. Although slavery is often seen as a negative aspect of ancient Egyptian society, it is important to remember that the treatment of slaves depended on their social status. Most slaves were treated exceptionally well and had the opportunity to learn a trade and earn their freedom. It is believed that this was because the society needed slaves to build ancient Egyptian monuments and temples and to help with agricultural work. Overall, slaves were an essential part of ancient Egyptian society, but they were not the basis of its existence. However, they contributed to its success. And that's all for today. Let us know your views in the comments section below, and do not forget to like this video before leaving. Thanks for watching.